Hey everyone, welcome to the Dill Pickle Movie Network. I am Dylan Randazzo. Pardon my kind of softer, more brooding tone today. I am coming off of a very exciting but very busy and very tiresome tech schedule for a show I'm in. So I'm gonna kind of take it a little bit more lax today, a little bit more easy. As I tell you about these 14 films that we're gonna be checking off the Oscars death list. Now you might be going 14 films. What does that make sense? It's because one of the 15 films that we would talk about normally was nominated for Best Picture. So we've already kind of covered that in the above the line categories. We are going through every single nomination in this year's Oscar race. The Oscars are tomorrow. I mean, this is getting to the nitty gritty. So I'm very, very excited to tell you about my thoughts on the best international, animated, and documentary feature films. Now, if you want to see my video for all the above the line categories, meaning the picture, director, acting, and screenplay awards, the music awards, score, song, or the short film awards, you can check out the previous three videos, which I will link in this video up in the top right corner throughout this video. But we are getting into the nitty gritty here. We're going to start with animated because I think that's probably the most accessible. Those are the ones that most people have seen. And starting off with The Boy and the Heron, which I thought was just a very, very stunning motion picture from Hayao Miyazaki, who originally announced it was his last film, but then kind of backtracked and said that this inspired him to want to make more films. But this is very much kind of a piece centered around his own kind of thesis as a filmmaker and what he views the cinema landscape to be and his own place in it, and kind of coming to terms with this kind of shift into his older age, into this kind of phase where he's on the brink of retirement and kind of reflecting on it. And you see a lot of that kind of woven throughout the thematic work in this story. I think it's one of those films that's much more about its themes and its emotional resonance than it is about its plot, but I think that's what makes it so engaging, and I think that's what makes it so different and makes Studio Ghibli's films in general so unique. I did a full review for this, so I'm not going to go too deep into it, but it is a very stunning motion picture, and it is nominated for Best Animated Feature. Moving on to Elemental, which is a film I didn't review on this channel because honestly, when I saw it, I didn't really have much to say. I think it's fine. I think for a Pixar film, I think I would have liked just a bigger swing, just a tad more ambition, a tad more gusto. This almost felt like an Illumination film, not to diss Illumination. I love some of their films. I mean, the Sing movies I think are great. But I really do think this kind of felt like a very low tier Pixar and a very like mid tier Illumination kind of DreamWorks feel. And that's not a diss because I think there are some good things in it. I think it's very interesting how this is an immigrant story, how they do play with this kind of diversity theme of, these opposites attracting fire and water. They cannot mix, but can they? It's a little on the nose. And I think that's kind of where the issue of the film is that I think now in the year of 2024, when you watch a film like this, it almost feels like this would have been really ambitious and really powerful back in like the early 2000s when Pixar was at its heyday. But I think now I feel like the whole message of, we should be nice to people who aren't like us is kind of, I don't want to say tired message because it's an important message, but it's a message that doesn't feel as revolutionary now as I think the film Elemental itself wants to try to make it seem. And because of it, also, you kind of dig into some stereotypes that I know, the filmmaker itself, himself is an immigrant. So I know that there are actual truths to a lot of the actual family dynamics, but there is a lot of stereotyping in the film that I think is kind of unintentional, but is definitely there in a similar way to how some people felt like Zootopia kind of fumbled the ball in some of those regards, even though I think Zootopia does it better than this. So I think it kind of walks a tricky tightrope, but I did like it for its central love story. I actually thought it was more impactful as a immigrant story than a love story, and I think they were trying to market it as a love story more than anything else. But it is a solid film. I mean, it's not bad, it's not great, but I think because it's Pixar, I think people were expecting a lot more, myself included. Next, moving on to Nimona, which is a Netflix film, which I was very, very much looking forward to because of the story of Nimona. Nimona deals with queer characters, queer themes. The main character of Nimona themselves is a non-binary character. They don't want to be one specific thing. They kind of shapeshift, and there's a very clear metaphor and allegory for that. And I really was intrigued by the story because Disney originally wanted to produce Nimona, or was producing Nimona, and then dropped it because of the queer themes, because Disney. And then Nimona got picked up by Blue Sky, but then Blue Sky went under as a studio, so then Netflix picked it up. So it's kind of been through this like carnival of different studios, and it finally settled. And it's a really, really nice message. It's got great metaphors, great themes, great queer elements. The problem with my overall opinion on Nimona is that I think the writing itself is so aimed towards kids that sometimes it gets a little grating, it gets a little childish. But again, animated films of any films of this Oscar slate are probably the ones that are going to cater toward kids the most. And I am a kid at heart, but some of the dialogue felt a little silly. But I still had a fun time. I mean, none of these movies are bad, even though Nimona probably didn't impact me as much as the other ones in this category did. I do appreciate it for its queer themes more than anything else. Its characterization. I also think the animation itself is not that great. It's not my particular favorite style of animation. So that kind of detracted it for me too. But I know there are huge champions of this film out there, and I am championing very certain elements of this film, and I am championing those who champion this film, even though I'm not quite on that wavelength yet, though I do appreciate it for all it stands for in terms of the business aspect of the film industry. Moving on to Robot Dreams, which people have been calling Past Lives Light, which they're not totally far off on. This tells a story about a dog who builds a robot, basically, and they fall in love, essentially. They become soulmates. And then one day, they go to the beach, and the robot kind of gets stuck in the sand, and the dog can't pull him out. And you see how they kind of distance themselves and how they kind of go their separate paths because of that. And it's really kind of heartbreaking. It's sad. Whether you take it as a legitimate love story or just a story about friendship. I mean, it is very sad to see these people go their separate ways, but then they kind of find a way to tie it all back to showing how they maybe how the history they had with one another led them to where they are now, and how the past will always inform who you are in the present. It's very much like Past Lives, where you have this woman who is reflecting on her past and this past relationship that was really meaningful to her, but acknowledging that she now has a present relationship and she's happy in her own way, despite missing out on what could have been with them. Like, it's very much that type of love triangle, given the way these characters, dog and robot, kind of go about their lives. There's great needle drops. September is a common theme. The 21st Night of September song is a common recurring motif that I really liked in this film. It's really well animated. The only thing I could knock it for is that I think it could have maybe been like a 40-minute short film. Like, I think it could have gotten all it needed to get across in a shorter amount of time. I think there's a lot of padding for time, which leads to some very cute bits, but I think the overall crux of the theme and the narrative could have been conveyed in a shorter format, and I would have liked to see that. But then again, when this film hits its final moments, it's almost like you feel like the journey was worth it. So I was ready to knock it off as like, oh, it should have been a short, but then at the end I was like, maybe it shouldn't have. I don't know. I'm still sitting with it, but I really did like it. I thought it was very charming, very sweet. And then moving on to Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, which is like the juggernaut of this category. This is the one that got all the box office money. This is the big superhero film of the year, and I think in a year with a lot of lacking superhero films, a superhero film that is this good really stands out. And I think that's what Spider-Man and Guardians 3 were for superhero movies this year, which was ultimately a very, very poor year for superhero movies between Quantumania and The Flash and the Marvels. I think Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse is kind of the breath of fresh air we needed. I wish it had come out later in the year, because I think it would have given even more life to the cinematic landscape than it would have when it came out in like March or April or May, I think. I forget what month it came out. Maybe it was June. I don't know. It was early though. But I do really like Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse. I think it's a great story. Also, like Nimona, I think there's some queer elements to it that I think honestly some people still haven't picked up on, but I think are very present, especially in terms of Gwen's story and her coming out story to her father. There's very clear queer parallels, which I think are very fascinating. That I think makes this more than just a superhero movie, or more than just an action movie, or more than just an animated romp, or more than just a diverse feature. Because this is really groundbreaking for its diversity as well, but makes it also inclusive in terms of its kind of deeper layers and meanings that are not necessarily addressed at the forefront, but are definitely there if you look hard enough. And I think a film like this may just be dismissed as, oh, it's the populist pick, but I think it's really smart. It's really clever. It's got a lot of great use of IP. I know I'm a big stickler for IP and cameos when I think they're unnecessary, but here it actually feels like they want to make a statement about the Spider-Man brand and this whole idea of these Nexus events, kind of, these core memories, or I'm getting into Inside Out territory, but you know what I mean? These kind of canon events. That's what I was looking for. The idea that every single Spider-Man story has to happen this way. And Miles says, why? Why can't we break convention? And that is a great larger overall theme in superhero movies in general. The fact that we keep seeing the same stuff over and over and over again. Spider-Man No Way Home, they literally recycled the same old trope. They just made it Aunt May instead of Uncle Ben and thought they were being revolutionary about it. But really, they were just kind of copying the same formula that we've seen from Spider-Man from time to time to time to time, to where it's so refreshing to see a film that tries to break that convention and have a character, Miles, say, no, this is not how it has to be. And whether or not this film, the trilogy, resolves that or not, whether they backtrack on that or not, I don't know. But the fact that this film is so preachy about breaking convention and not necessarily needing to follow the exact script that your life or your franchise or your IP has to say to you, I think is very groundbreaking, very revolutionary. So, in ranking these films, how I would rank them, I would definitely put Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse at number one. It was my favorite animated film of the year, feature length. Pachyderm was my favorite animated project of the year. Then I would put Robot Dreams. I think it was just that thematically resonant for me. Number three, I'll put Boy and the Heron, though it's very close between that and Robot Dreams. I just think Robot Dreams for me was a little bit more accessible, whereas I'm still waiting to watch Boy and the Heron one more time to really soak in every little ounce of what it was saying. Then I'll put Elemental just because Pixar still nails it with the animation. Then I'll put Nimona just because I thought the animation itself wasn't that great, even though I can appreciate a lot about it. Next, we're going to move on to the best international features, and we've already covered one in the above the line category video. So, Zone of Interest, I won't be talking about today, but I'm going to be talking next about Io Capitano, which is an Italian film. This tells the story of two immigrants who are trying to escape their country. I'm going to try to find Senegal. Senegal. They're from Senegal. I had to look it up. Senegal. They are trying to reach Italy to escape their poverty. And I think it's a very fascinating story. I think it's a very empowering immigrant story. It doesn't feel that much original, that much more original than other immigrant stories we've seen, especially African immigrant stories. But it's always useful to have these stories because they're still very relevant and very topical subjects. The only thing that doesn't really sit well with me is that it is a white filmmaker and it is an Italian filmmaker. And I know the whole point is that they're trying to immigrate to Italy. So there's that tie, but it just feels a little off base when watching this. I'm like, this is just a white Italian dude telling the story. And yes, you should be able to make any film you want. You know, filmmakers have visions, they have their own way of expressing themselves. But I think, just thinking about all the ins and outs of the cultural, authenticity of it, and just the idea of trying to tap into this character's psyche, because it is so reliant on this whole black experience, this African experience. And I don't necessarily know if this was necessarily the right person to make this film, even though I think he does a great job with it. That was the only thing that wasn't quite sitting well with me, but again, it was a very well done film still. Regardless, it's very well shot. It moves at a pretty nice pace and it has a very good payoff. It's just, I don't think it set itself apart, especially from the rest of the films in this category. Moving on to the next best international feature film nominee, which is Perfect Days from Japan, directed by Wim Wenders. Another film where it's like, this is mostly set in Japan and it is a Japanese film, but it's a German director. But I love Wim Wenders, so I was not too bothered by it like I was Io Capitano. But I think Perfect Days is a really nice kind of slice of life film about mundanity. And I think a lot of films like to progress the action in a fast or suspenseful or action packed way. But I really think there's something nice about the Perfect Days approach where you're just watching this man go through his everyday life as a toilet repairman in Japan. First off, I think it's really cool how they use the production design to show us these kind of like really interesting bathroom systems in Japan. I've never thought about other countries' bathrooms very much. I think about their transportation sometimes, but never really their bathrooms. But it was very insightful, very informative. It does get a little repetitive, but I think that's definitely the point of the film. You're trying to show this guy in his everyday life and how he kind of goes about his life. But then at the end, you kind of see how it kind of shapes who he is and his overall outlook. It's very much a character piece, very much a vibes piece, but I did very much vibe with it and I very much enjoyed it. Moving on next to Society of the Snow from Spain, which is actually nominated for 2 awards at this Oscars. It broke through, and I think it's deserving because this is also a technical juggernaut as much as it is a great story. This is essentially the same story as the film Alive, where it's that the soccer team that gets stuck in the Andes Mountains after a plane crash. You don't necessarily know, if you don't know the story, which I was one of the very few who didn't. But if you don't know the story, it takes some drastic turns that I didn't expect. Just because I think Hollywood filmmaking and international filmmaking, there's a certain line that Hollywood filmmaking just never seems to cross. That this film did, because it wasn't necessarily Hollywood filmmaking. There was a little bit more artistic freedom and expression. And I think because of it, it led to some really like kind of off-putting, but also also very impactful and like jarring sequences and scenes and moments and events that I think for this story you need to tell because that's the true story. But even more so, they really dive into making it as gruesome and as authentic as possible. And that's why it got the makeup nomination because it is gruesome. It is, very hard to watch. It's a very uncomfortable sit. And it is a long sit because you want to feel like you're in these characters' shoes, or I guess boots, because they're in the mountains. Actually, I don't know if they had boots. I think that's the whole point is that they didn't have boots. They weren't prepared to be stuck and stranded in snow for so long. But you start to see how they kind of fester away and how they have to kind of go to the darkest, deepest, horrible depths of humanity to survive. And I think that was very interesting. I think some people have been saying it's too long, too boring, too slow, but I think that is so integral in telling the story it wants to tell and show the pacing it wants to show. And I thought it was really impactful. I thought it was really good, really well designed. I was a big fan of this film, even though it made me very uncomfortable, and I probably don't want to watch it again. But that's what all great films do, don't they? Moving on next to the Teacher's Lounge from Germany. This one I really, really liked. This is one that I didn't have any expectation for, and I think that's why I really, really liked it. This tells a story of a woman who is a new teacher to the school, and then there is a slight controversy, not a slight, a pretty major controversy. Someone has been stealing from the Teacher's Lounge, stealing money from people's wallets, and this woman goes about it to try to set out a mission and try to find who did it. And in doing so, she captures a video, but that leads to a whole spiral snowball effect of a lot of different miscommunications and arguments and betrayals and gossip and rumors. And it really just illustrates how hard it is to be a teacher. Not just teaching the subjects and making sure you're actually letting these kids learn and making sure they are growing as human beings, but also just the social dynamics of being that kind of common enemy that all the kids can point fingers at, or being that person that is, an easy ammunition and an easy target for ammunition from the parents, even when controversy arises and when things aren't going right, or when kids aren't doing well, or when certain events happen. Who gets the finger pointed at them, because it's a very thankless job. And I am very thankful that I'm surrounded by so many amazing teachers in my life, and I am very grateful for the teachers I had in my life, but they don't get enough thanks in their world. And I think this kind of film highlights that, but it does so in a very stressful, very suspenseful way. Not in the fact that it's building to any sort of twist either, but it's just building suspense through tension and stress. It's a very stressful film. It reminds me of a Safdie brothers film like Uncut Gems, where it just kind of keeps going, it keeps going, it keeps going, it keeps going. I do think the resolution, I would have liked maybe a bigger, stronger ending, but it ended in a very interesting way, and it's in a way I've thought about recently since finishing it. So, Teachers Lounge is one that I think is very underrated that you should all seek out because it is very good. If I had to rank these films now, including The Zone of Interest, I would put The Zone of Interest at number one. I think it is the most singular, the most unique, the most important film of the year, honestly, of any category. I think it's one of those films that is going to be an all timer when we look back at film history. It's going to be a film that's taught in schools and subjects. Speaking of schools, though, Teachers Lounge is number two. This is the biggest surprise of the category. And if I had done this before the Pickle Awards, I probably would have nominated it for Best International Film there. Best Society of the Snow is number three. Number four, I'll put Perfect Days. I thought it was really lovely. And then at number five, Io Capitano. Not a bad film in this category, which is really nice. I liked all those films. So that's a pretty great thing. Moving on to documentary feature film, which is kind of the other side of the coin, where I thought all of them were okay, but there were some glaring snubs in the documentary category that just really pissed me off, that I felt like I was giving these films a disservice because I was just thinking in the back of my head, how is this better than Beyond Utopia or Menus Plaisirs Le Tourgois or American Symphony, even, which was a really stunning musical biopic or documentary, still a Michael J. Fox story. Like, there were so many great documentaries this year, but that being said, there are some really important things to talk about in these ones as well. So I'm going to talk about them, starting with Bobby Wine, the People's President. This tells the story of it's an Ugandan British American film. It's kind of like a hybrid. It's produced by National Geographic / Disney, but it tells a story about a leader in, I believe the country is Uganda. I think it's Uganda. He's a Ugandan politician. He was a pop star, actually. He was a musician who kind of fought for rights in Uganda, tried to become a politician. And it was very interesting. It's a very interesting story about a guy who has clearly got a lot of energy, a lot of life to him. Um, the only thing is that I think because it's National Geographic, you kind of know what you're getting into. There's not necessarily anything groundbreaking about the way it's presented. It reminded me a lot of the documentary shorts, like the Barber of Little Rock, or even the ABCs of Book Banning, where it's like a very important issue. It's a very important topic, a very important subject, But was it told in the most interesting way? I don't think so. But it's a very interesting story and a very interesting figure nonetheless. Moving on to The Eternal Memory, which is just a very, very depressing film. This tells a story about a man with Alzheimer's and kind of in his late stages of life, which it's already hard in a narrative film to show, Alzheimer's, in an authentic way and an empathetic way and show it without making it too miserable. But to actually show a documentary where it's quite literal life, it's not actors portraying it. I mean, this was just the toughest sit. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean, obviously the most powerful movies should be the toughest sits, but man, it was just so miserable and sad. And and there are moments of life where it's like, oh, there's some moments of sweetness, but it's overall kind of blanketed by this underlying sadness, which I thought was just devastating. But it is a very impactful documentary nonetheless. Moving on next to The Four Daughters, which I thought was probably the most interesting use of form. I'm talking about how a lot of these documentaries don't feel like they have the most interesting presentation. Here, I think the presentation is even more interesting than the subject matter. The subject matter is very interesting as well. I mean, it's a mother and her four daughters, two of her daughters who are estranged, and you kind of see their journey and you kind of hear about how they came to be estranged and how the family dynamic kind of it didn't uplift them but tore them apart in a way and kind of led them to where they were at and how they struggled with some of the family dynamics that led them to be where they are. And the most interesting thing is that two of the daughters are still estranged, so they have actresses filling in for those two daughters in kind of reenacting these moments. So there's reenactments, which are really interesting because you have actors who are stepping in for the real life figures. When the material gets too heavy, they're like, here, tag out. You're going to play this character now. You have actresses who are hired to play people who aren't even there because of certain reasons. It's just very fascinating. I thought this was one of the most interesting ways to present a documentary in having these reenactments, having these actresses with the real life figures, kind of recounting these stories. How do you act out your own life? How do you tell your own story in a way that's cinematic? And this film really deals with that. And I love how this film kind of talks about the artistic process and leaves the camera rolling after they say cut, so we can get those real authentic moments of not just them telling their story, but kind of grasping with the idea of telling their story and how they're going to tell their story and what they want to show, what they don't want to show, what's easy for them, what's hard for them, what have they prepared their whole life to say. One character talks about, or one woman, they're not characters, they're real people, talks about how they've gone through this you know breakthrough, this revelation with their therapist, their shrink, over and over and over again. So near here saying it for the camera doesn't it doesn't phase them anymore. And it's that kind of stuff that's just so impactful to me as a viewer. This is really, really great. And I think if this had been viewed before the Pickle Awards, I would have also nominated this. So it's worth noting this is a really good one. To Kill a Tiger is the next one we're going to talk about, which kind of came out of nowhere. No one was really seeing it coming on Oscar morning, but I'm glad it happened. That's kind of what the merits of the Oscars are, is to get us to see films we maybe didn't know about or didn't necessarily have any intuition about before. To Kill a Tiger tells a story about a father trying to basically get justice for his daughter's very, very horrible sexual assault case, and it is as hard to watch as you'd think it would be. There's kind of a similar sentiment that I have for this that I had for Io Capitano, where I feel like it is still very much told from a male perspective, even though it is centered around a young woman's story. But again, like, because this is about the dad kind of going about it, trying to like get this justice, it makes sense that it's very much from his perspective and not the daughter's. Even though I would have liked to see a little bit more female perspective in this film, because it is dealing with especially women's sexual assault in this country, or in the country of what country is it? I think it's India. Yeah, India. And how sexual assault is still a problem there. It's a problem everywhere, but especially in this village, and how the village kind of has this mob mentality about rallying against or for a certain group. I thought it was very harrowing, but it is one of those documentaries that is so heavy, and this is even longer than something like The Eternal Memory, so the heaviness really weighed on me after time, to where I needed to like just take a breath every so often, because I don't like to pause movies. I think you lose the effect of a movie if you pause it, but I needed to kind of turn away and just take a breath and like close my eyes for a bit, just because it was just, whew, it was very heavy. I'm moving on to 20 Days in Mariupol, which, if you thought that was heavy, this is even heavier. This is literal documentation of the first few 20 days in Mariupol in Ukraine. This is quite literally a man with a camera on the battlegrounds, on the sites of the war, where the explosions happened, where all the buildings had crumbled, where all the bodies lie helpless. It is absolutely stomach sickening, but it is a very integral film, almost like how Zone of Interest is, where it's like you don't want to watch it again. You probably can't watch it again. It's one of those films where I'd be surprised if anyone watches it twice, and if you have, good on you, I guess, because this is just such a heavy documentary, but it is such an effective one, especially considering the war is still going on. We had a film Navalny come out last year that was very much centered around this Russian conflict, and now we get another film that feels very topical as well. And yes, maybe it's not the most flashy way of documentating a film, but I mean, he's literally taking a camera and running through the streets in the middle of a war. I mean, that is as documentary as you get. That is as close to real life as you get. There's no fabrication. And I think that's why it's such an interesting juxtaposition with Four Daughters, because Four Daughters is almost staged. There's almost like a rhyme and reason to the way it's portrayed. Whereas 20 Days in Mariupol, there's no game plan, there's no blueprint, there's no storyboarding. They're just going into it and just getting whatever footage they can. And then the actual crafting of the story comes with the editing, which is also an impressive editing feat because they had to edit all this footage together to give it some sort of narrative. Whereas other films, the kind of narrative is already pre planned. That's why the documentaries are so fascinating because you have so many different types. You have the types of documentaries where they just leave a camera rolling, like 20 Days in Mariupol, and they can just leave a camera rolling and see what they get and then edit it after. And then you have movies like Four Daughters or even The Eternal Memory where they're like, hey, this is the story we want to tell, this is how we want to frame it, this is how we want to go about it, now let's do it. And still getting these real authentic moments. But 20 Days in Mariupol just hit me like a ton of bricks. It's a film I never want to see again. It's a film I didn't necessarily like, but it's the film I think is the most important of all these films and the one that I personally would choose as my favorite. Getting into my ranking though, yeah, 20 Days in Mariupol is number one, just because I think it's the most important film, maybe next to Zone of Interest this entire year, and it's very harrowing. But number two is The Four Daughters. I just loved what it had to do with the form of the documentary filmmaking. To Kill a Tiger's number three. Great subject matter, very empowering story, but very hard to watch. Number four, same thing, The Eternal Memory. Great subject matter, very hard to watch. Number five, Bobby Wine, The People's President, only because I felt the documentary was the most bland in the way it was actually presented and constructed. But there we go. We're now going to cross 14. We already crossed Zone of Interest off, but let's cross these 14 off the list. There we go. They're green. And that is it. So now we have only a few more films to knock off this list. We're almost there. We just have a few tech categories to go. We're going to be talking about some films that were only nominated for tech awards probably tomorrow on the morning of Oscars, and then I will be here with my Oscar predictions. We're getting to the nitty gritty, and it's very, very exciting. But if you want to follow this death race and watch the conclusion and see my Oscar nominations, see my Oscar reactions on Monday, like and subscribe to this channel. This is the most important time to subscribe to the channel because you're going to get notifications. Ring that bell. You're going to get notifications for everything because I'm going to be putting out a lot of videos in the next few weeks, and I'm going to try to put out even more videos, even more and more as the weeks go on, because we're getting out of the Oscars but into so much other fun stuff. I haven't even seen Dune Part 2 yet because I've been so busy watching Oscars death race films and opening another show and getting ready for a film premiere in Detroit for another film I did. I mean, it's a very exciting time to be a film fan, in the height of Oscar season, and I'm just loving the ride, and I thank you all for joining me. So please like and subscribe, and I will see you next time with the final installment of the Oscars death race. We're gonna get there. We have one more day to watch a few more films. I'm very excited. See you then.